My name is Evelyn Reed, and I'm 78 years old. In my small town of Havenwood, Colorado, I'm known for two things: my prize-winning hydrangeas and being the widow of a ghost. 41 years ago, my husband, Samuel, a charming man with eyes the color of a summer sky and a smile that could talk a dog off a meat wagon, went on a hunting trip in the Rockies and never came back. No body, no note, just a truck found by the side of an old logging road. After 5 years, the law declared him dead. After 10, my heart finally agreed. I raised our daughter, Clara, on a librarian's salary and the quiet strength that only comes from surviving the unthinkable. I built a life, not on his memory, but on the ashes of his disappearance. It was a good life. A quiet life. Then, 6 months ago, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find him. Samuel. He looked older, of course. The boyish charm was weathered into the deep lines of a man in his 70s, his hair was a shock of white, but it was him. The sky-blue eyes, the crooked smile, it was all there. A miracle, you might think. A testament to enduring love. You'd be wrong. I am not the naive 28-year-old girl he left behind. The moment I saw him, my heart didn't swell with love, it went cold with suspicion. Because while he had my husband's face, he had a stranger's fear in his eyes. This wasn't a miraculous reunion. It was an invasion. And I knew, in that instant, this story wouldn't end with a tearful embrace. It would end with the truth, no matter how sharp its teeth. He told me a story, a well-rehearsed tale of amnesia. He claimed he'd fallen during the hunting trip, hit his head, and woken up in a shelter hundreds of miles away with no memory of who he was. He'd lived for 4 decades as John Doe, a drifter, working odd jobs, until a recent fall supposedly jogged his memory loose. He cried as he told me this, his shoulders shaking. He said he'd found his way back by tracing the faint echoes of a name, Evelyn. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar. I played my part, too. I feigned shock, then tearful relief. I let him in, made him coffee, and listened as he marveled at photographs of the daughter he'd never known and the grandchildren who shouldn't exist in his world. But as he spoke, my mind was not on the past. It was a library, cross-referencing details, noting inconsistencies. He remembered the name of our first dog, but not that she was deaf in one ear. He remembered our wedding day, but not the torrential downpour that forced us to move the reception into a barn. These were small things, tiny cracks in his story, but to a librarian who spent her life cataloging details, they were chasms. He was a book with a convincing cover but pages that didn't match. He believed he was fooling a lonely old woman, starved for a ghost to come home. He didn't realize he had knocked on the door of the one person who knew Samuel Reed better than Samuel knew himself. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that the man sitting in her living room was a liar. That night, as he slept in the guest room, I did not sleep. I sat in my study, the faint glow of my laptop illuminating the face of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life. This man had come to my home to play a role. He wanted something, money, a place to hide, I didn't know. But I would find out. He thought he was the hunter, returning from the wild. He was about to learn that for 41 years, I had been the one surviving in the wilderness. And the most dangerous thing in the woods is the creature you don't see coming. My hunt for the truth had just begun. For the next week, I became the finest actress Havenwood had ever seen. I played the part of the doting wife, rediscovering the ghost who had walked back into my life. I cooked his favorite meals, or what he claimed were his favorite meals. He'd say, "Oh, Evelyn, your pot roast." It's just how I remember, and I'd smile, knowing full well Samuel despised pot roast and had a near religious devotion to my shepherd's pie. Each of these small failures was a confirmation, another piece of evidence I catalogued in the quiet library of my mind. He was a good actor, but he was working from a script written by a stranger, full of generalities but lacking the intimate, specific details that weave a life together. His questions, however, were far more revealing than his answers. He was subtly, but persistently, interested in my financial situation. "This is a lovely home, Evelyn," he'd say, running a hand over my solid oak mantelpiece. "You've done well for yourself. Was the librarian's pension enough, or did Samuel have a life insurance policy?" I'd answer vaguely, "Oh, we managed. Samuel always made sure we were taken care of." I watched his eyes, the flicker of calculation. He wasn't a grieving husband trying to piece together a lost life, he was an assessor taking inventory. He asked about our daughter, Clara, with a detached curiosity. Not, "What is she like?" but, "Is she married? What does her husband do for a living?" He was mapping my resources, my connections. He saw my family not as people to love, but as assets or liabilities on a balance sheet. I let him believe he was in control, that his performance was flawless. I'd reminisce about old times, leading him with carefully chosen prompts. "Do you remember that little diner we loved just outside of town? The one with the cherry pie?" I asked one afternoon. "Of course," he said with a warm, confident smile. "The Red Rooster Diner." A good guess, but wrong. It was called the Bluebird Cafe, and Samuel and I went there every Friday. The Red Rooster was a tourist trap that opened 10 years after he disappeared. I simply nodded, filing the error away. He was building his entire character on guesswork and luck, and I was letting him build his own cage, bar by bar. One evening, he caught me in my study, going over bank statements. "Still sharp with the numbers, I see," he said, leaning against the doorframe. The casual intrusion felt like a violation. "A woman alone has to be," I replied coolly. His gaze lingered on the papers. "I hate to be a burden, Evelyn," he started, his voice dripping with false humility. "But I have nothing. 40 years of my life, gone. I'll need to get a new driver's license, a social security number, it's all so overwhelming. I might need a little help to get back on my feet." It was the first move, the first test of my willingness to provide. "Of course, Samuel," I said, my voice as sweet as poison. "Whatever you need." As he walked away, satisfied, I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed an ally. I needed my daughter. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was for the family he was trying to infiltrate. I picked up the phone and dialed Clara. The performance was over. It was time for the investigation to begin. Clara, my daughter, is a prosecutor. She deals in facts, evidence, and the kind of cold, hard logic that leaves no room for sentimentality. When I called and told her, "Your father is alive. He's here," her reaction was a stunned, joyous silence, followed by a flood of questions. For a moment, she was just a girl who finally got her father back. I let her have that moment, let the hope wash over her, before I gently, methodically, pulled the plug. "Clara, honey, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Something is wrong. I don't think it's him." I laid out the evidence like she would for a jury, the pot roast, the diner, the wrong memories, the unnerving focus on our finances. As I spoke, I could hear the prosecutor in her taking over. The emotional daughter receded, replaced by the sharp, analytical mind I knew so well. "Okay, Mom," she said, her voice now clipped and professional. "Don't confront him. Don't let him know you suspect anything. Just keep playing the part. I'm on my way." She arrived the next day, not with tears and a homecoming party, but with a briefcase and a plan. The reunion she staged for his benefit was flawless. She cried, she hugged him, she called him Dad. The man preened under the attention, his confidence swelling. He thought he had just won over his most important conquest. That evening, after he was asleep, Clara and I sat in the kitchen, the room illuminated by the glow of her laptop. "First things first," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "We need irrefutable proof. We need his DNA." The plan was simple and brilliant. The next morning, Clara presented him with a gift, a high-tech smart water bottle. "It tracks your hydration, Dad. We want to make sure you're staying healthy after everything." He was touched by the gesture. What he didn't know was that Clara had already swabbed the inside of the bottle for his DNA. "I'll also need a sample from you, Mom," she said, pulling out a cheek swab kit. "But for the comparison to be definitive, we need something of Dad's from before he disappeared." I knew exactly what to get. In a dusty box in the attic, I kept a few of Samuel's things I could never bear to part with. Among them was his old shaving kit. I carefully opened the leather pouch and pulled out the safety razor he had used the morning he left. Tucked inside, caught in the metal, were several tiny whiskers. Hairs. 41 years old, but containing the one thing that could not lie, his genetic code. Clara took the samples, placing them in evidence bags with the practiced ease of a professional. "I'll send these to a trusted lab in Denver. We'll have the results in a week," she said. "Until then, we treat him like a king. We make him feel safe. We make him feel like he's finally come home." The first thread of his lie had been pulled. Now, we just had to wait and watch it all unravel. While the lab in Denver processed the truth, Clara worked on the lie. If he was John Doe for 40 years, he would have left a footprint, no matter how faint, she explained, her face illuminated by her screen. Credit reports, hospital visits, traffic tickets, arrests, a man can't exist for 4 decades in this country without creating a paper trail. But as she dug, she found nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was as if the man in my guest room hadn't existed before he walked up my driveway. This wasn't the trail of a simple drifter, it was the work of a ghost, a man intentionally staying off the grid. The absence of evidence was, in itself, damning evidence. Meanwhile, my job was to keep the imposter comfortable and distracted. I suggested we go through some old photo albums. "To help bring back your memories," I said sweetly. He was eager to play along, pointing at strangers and guessing their names, creating false memories in real time. But my goal wasn't the photos. My goal was the attic. "Samuel, my love, there's a box of your old things up there. I wonder if seeing them might help." His eyes lit up. He probably thought he'd find some forgotten treasure. But I was looking for something else. Amidst the dusty relics of a life cut short, I found it, Samuel's old leather-bound hunting journal. That night, with the imposter snoring softly down the hall, I sat in my study and opened the journal. Samuel's familiar, looping script filled the pages. He wrote about the weather, the wildlife, the quiet solitude of the mountains. I flipped to the last few entries from October 1983. He wrote about his plans for his final trip of the season. Then, on the last written page, dated the day before he vanished, I found it. "Met a fellow hunter at the supply store today. A man named Walter Finch. Greenhorn, talks a big game but doesn't know a deer track from a rabbit's. Something about him I don't trust. Eyes are too hungry. He invited himself along on my route tomorrow. Said he's looking for a big score. I told him the mountains don't pay in cash. Walter Finch." The name was a lightning strike in the darkness. This wasn't some random con man who had stumbled upon a story. This was personal. I reread the last line. I told him the mountains don't pay in cash. A cold dread washed over me. Samuel had been a geologist before taking up hunting full-time. He'd always said those mountains held more than just timber and game. He'd been prospecting, on and off, for years, convinced he was close to a significant mineral deposit, a big score. This man, Walter, hadn't just been after Samuel's life. He had been after his discovery. The hungry eyes, the talk of a big score, it all clicked into place. The ghost in my house had a name. And now, I suspected, he had a motive for murder. The phone call from Clara came 2 days later. Her voice was devoid of all emotion. "It's done, Mom. The results are in." She didn't need to say more. "Not a match," I stated. It wasn't a question. "Not even close," she confirmed. "There's a 0% chance that the man in your house is my father. Genetically, he's a complete stranger." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. We now had the weapon we needed. The question was no longer if he was a liar, but how we would use that fact against him. We had to move beyond proving the lie and start uncovering the truth of what happened to my Samuel. That evening, we put our plan into motion. We didn't confront him in anger. We set a scene. I asked him to join Clara and me in the living room for a family talk. I placed a framed photo of Samuel on the mantelpiece, watching over us. Clara sat on the sofa, a legal pad in her lap, looking every bit the prosecutor she was. The man walked in, a confident smile on his face, expecting, perhaps, an offering of a joint bank account. He sat in the armchair opposite us, the honored guest at his own execution. "Samuel," I began, my voice soft. "Clara and I have been talking. We are so happy to have you back. But there are formalities. For the state to officially recognize you as alive again, we need to provide them with definitive proof of identity." "Of course, Evelyn," he said magnanimously. "Whatever you need." "Fingerprints? A sworn statement?" He was so sure of himself. Clara looked up from her pad, her gaze as sharp as shattered glass. "Actually," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet room, "we already took care of it. We ran a DNA comparison. We matched your sample against hairs from Dad's old razor." She let the silence stretch, watching him process her words. His smile faltered. The color began to drain from his face as he realized the corner he was in. He knew what a DNA test was. He knew what it would show. The confident mask was crumbling, revealing the panicked fraud beneath. "The test came back this morning," I said, my voice as cold and clear as a mountain stream. "There is no possibility that you are Samuel Reed. So, we're going to ask you one more time. Who are you?" He stared at us, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a deck. The amnesia story was dead. The loving husband act was over. He was trapped. He looked from my face to Clara's, searching for an escape route that wasn't there. His eyes darted around the room, finally landing on Samuel's hunting journal, which I had deliberately left on the coffee table. He visibly flinched. His shoulders slumped in defeat. The fight was over. "My name," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "is Walter Finch." With his identity stripped away, Walter Finch seemed to shrink in the armchair. The arrogant charmer was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. But he was not defeated. He was simply changing tactics. He looked at us, his eyes welling with crocodile tears, and launched into his second, more desperate performance. "You have to understand," he began, his voice choked with manufactured emotion. "I never meant for any of this to happen. Samuel, he was my friend. He claimed they had become fast friends on that hunting trip. He painted a picture of two men bonding in the wilderness, sharing stories by the campfire. Then came the tragedy. According to Walter, they were tracking a buck along a high, narrow ridge. Samuel, he claimed, was reaching for a better vantage point when the rock beneath his feet gave way. I tried to grab him, Walter sobbed, burying his face in his hands. I had his hand, but he slipped. He fell. It was a terrible fall. I climbed down, he was gone. There was nothing I could do. He said he panicked. He was a young man, terrified, alone in the wilderness with a dead body. He was afraid no one would believe it was an accident. So, he ran. He ran from the scene, ran from his own life, and spent the next 40 years living in shame and fear. Coming here, he said, looking up at me, his eyes pleading for absolution, was my attempt at penance. I couldn't bear the thought of you not knowing. But I couldn't bring myself to tell you the horrible truth. So I pretended. I thought if I could give you Samuel back, even for a little while, it might make up for what happened. I just wanted to see you happy. It was a masterful story. It recast him from a con man into a tragic, guilt-ridden figure. It was designed to evoke pity, to make us see him not as a villain, but as another victim of a terrible accident. He was offering us a clean, simple explanation for our pain. Clara and I listened without interruption, our faces impassive masks. We let him spin his entire web of lies. An accident. A tragic fall. A man crippled by guilt. It was plausible. It was neat. It was also a complete and utter fabrication, and I knew it. A man running from an accidental death doesn't show up 41 years later to subtly inquire about life insurance policies. A guilt-ridden friend doesn't fail to remember the name of his best friend's favorite diner. His story was a lie, but it was a lie that contained the kernel of the truth. He had been there. He had seen Samuel die. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that Samuel hadn't slipped. He had been pushed. "Thank you, Walter," I said, my voice softer than it had been all evening. Clara shot me a sharp, questioning look, but I gave a subtle shake of my head. This was a new phase of the hunt. Anger and accusations would make him shut down. Pity and understanding would make him arrogant. And I needed him arrogant. "Thank you for finally telling us the truth. I can't imagine the burden you've carried all these years." Walter looked up, surprised by my tone. He had expected a fight, a call to the police. He was not prepared for empathy. It was the one thing his script hadn't accounted for. I continued, playing the role of a grieving widow finally granted the mercy of closure. To know he didn't suffer, to know it was a quick, tragic accident, it's a comfort. I let a single, perfect tear roll down my cheek. "You were just a boy, terrified and alone. We don't blame you for running. We blame the mountain." Walter stared at me, his relief palpable. He was buying it. He believed he had successfully navigated the most dangerous part of his con. He saw us not as threats, but as two grieving women who were grateful for his story, no matter how false it was. He was beginning to see me as the easy mark he had first imagined. For the next few days, we treated him with a delicate, cautious kindness. We told him he could stay for a little while longer, to help us all process the news. We shared quiet meals, the accident hanging in the air between us, an unspoken truce. But I was watching him. I saw the way his relief was slowly being replaced by a renewed sense of entitlement. He started making suggestions about the house. "You know, this wall could be knocked down to open up the living space," he said one afternoon. He was testing the waters, seeing how far his new role as the tragic keeper of secrets would take him. He had confessed to being present at Samuel's death, and instead of punishment, he was being offered a seat at the dinner table. In his mind, he hadn't just gotten away with it, he was being rewarded. One evening, I found him in the study, looking at a large geological map of the county that Samuel had framed on the wall. He was always so fascinated by these mountains, Walter said, a little too casually. He used to say they were full of secrets. I walked over and stood beside him. He believed he was close to finding a significant silver lode up near where the accident happened, I said softly, planting the seed. I watched his face in the reflection of the glass. A flicker of greed, dark and unmistakable, passed through his eyes before he could hide it. That was it. That was the motive. The accident was a lie. This was never about guilt. It was about greed. And his greed was the weapon I was going to use to destroy him. That night, I called Clara. It's not enough, I told her, my voice a low, determined whisper. His story about the accident will be impossible to disprove after 41 years. There's no body, no evidence. If we call the police now, he'll be a person of interest, but they'll likely never be able to charge him. He'll walk free. So, what do we do, Mom? Clara asked, the frustration evident in her voice. We make him confess, I said. Not to an accident. To a murder. My plan was audacious, and it was dangerous. But I had spent 4 decades living in the shadow of a question mark. I would not spend the rest of my life knowing my husband's killer was walking free because I couldn't prove what he'd done. The law could not give Samuel justice. So, I would. He thinks I'm a fragile old woman, I explained to Clara. He thinks he's successfully manipulated me with his sob story. We're going to use that arrogance against him. The bait isn't me anymore. The bait is Samuel's legacy. The plan had 2 parts. First, we needed to create the illusion of wealth. Clara, using her legal expertise, drafted a set of convincing but entirely fake documents, a geological survey report confirming a massive silver deposit on the land Samuel had been prospecting, and a contract from a mining corporation offering a multi-million-dollar buyout for the mineral rights. The second part was psychological. I had to convince Walter that the only thing standing between him and that money was me, and that the only way to get me to sign over the rights was to give me the one thing I craved more than money, the whole, unvarnished truth about Samuel's final moments. I'm going to tell him I can't be at peace, that I can't sign anything, until I know exactly what happened, I laid out for Clara. I'll tell him I need the closure that only the absolute truth can provide. I'll make him believe that my grief is the final lock, and his detailed confession is the only key. It was a monstrous gamble. I was going to dangle a fortune in front of a murderer and ask him to describe killing my husband in exchange for it. Clara was silent for a long moment. Mom, she finally said, her voice a mix of awe and terror. This is insane. I know, I replied. But he underestimated the woman he was trying to fool. He thinks my grief makes me weak. I'm going to prove that it's the strongest weapon I have. The architect of justice was ready to build her trap. The next 3 days were the most intense of my life. My quiet home was transformed into the set of a thriller, and I was the director. Clara's first task was to secure the set. She brought in a tech expert, a young man who worked with her office on surveillance cases. Under the guise of upgrading my home security system, he installed multiple, tiny, high-definition cameras in the living room, one in a smoke detector, another disguised as a book on the shelf, a third in a floral arrangement. He placed miniature microphones that could pick up a whisper from across the room. My cozy living room was now a state-of-the-art recording studio, ready to capture a killer's confession. Our second task was securing the perimeter. I didn't want the local police involved yet, a marked car sitting down the street would spook him. Instead, Clara called in a favor from a trusted family friend, a retired, highly decorated state police detective named Frank Miller. He was a man who understood that sometimes justice requires unorthodox methods. He agreed to wait in a discreet, unmarked car just 2 blocks away, monitoring a live audio feed from the house. If I spoke a prearranged code word, hydrangea, he and his former partner would be through the door in less than 60 seconds. Finally, I prepared my props and rehearsed my role. I scattered the fake geological surveys and the multi-million-dollar mining contract on the coffee table as if I had been reviewing them. I placed the framed wedding photo of Samuel and me in the center, a silent, judging audience. Then, I practiced. I stood in front of the mirror, letting my shoulders slump, my eyes fill with a carefully crafted blend of sorrow and confusion. I practiced the tremor in my voice, the way my hand would shake as I offered him a cup of tea. I had to become the woman he believed I was, a broken, grieving widow, emotionally vulnerable and easily manipulated by a tale of shared grief, a perfect mark on the verge of a massive payday. I had to make him feel so completely in control, so certain of his victory, that his confession would feel less like an admission and more like a boast. As I looked at my reflection, the 78-year-old librarian, I saw a stranger staring back, a cold, calculating hunter, ready to avenge her mate. I told Walter we needed to talk. He walked into the living room that evening, his eyes immediately drawn to the papers on the coffee table. He feigned polite disinterest, but I could see the greed quailing behind his placid expression. I began my performance. My voice was fragile, my hands trembling as I poured him a cup of tea. "Walter," I started, "I've been thinking about what you told me, about the accident. And I've been thinking about Samuel's legacy." I gestured to the papers. "This mining company, they want to buy the rights to the land where he died. It's a lot of money, Walter. Enough to change lives." His eyes gleamed. "Evelyn, that's wonderful news," he said, his voice thick with false sincerity. "Samuel would have wanted this for you." I shook my head, letting a tear fall. "But I can't sign it," I whispered. "I can't profit from his death until my heart is at peace. And it's not. That story you told me, about the fall, something feels missing." I looked him directly in the eye, my gaze full of manufactured anguish. "I need the real truth, Walter. Every last detail. I need you to walk me through that day, moment by moment. I need to know everything, no matter how ugly. It's the only way I can find closure. It's the only way I can sign those papers and give you a share for your troubles." The bait was dangling. Money, absolution, and the final manipulation of a grieving widow. It was too much for a man like him to resist. His arrogance took over. He leaned back, a smug, predatory smile touching his lips. He thought he was about to deliver the final, masterful stroke of his con. "You're right, Evelyn," he said, his voice dropping. "It wasn't an accident." He began to speak, and the hidden cameras rolled. He described how he'd seen Samuel's survey maps, how he'd realized the man was sitting on a fortune. He confessed to following him up that ridge, waiting for the perfect moment. "He was a fool," Walter sneered. "So trusting. He was looking out at the valley, talking about the future he was going to build for you and his daughter. I just helped him along." He described the shove, the shock on Samuel's face, the long fall to the rocks below. He spoke with no remorse, only the pride of a predator recalling a successful hunt. "And now," he finished, leaning forward with a greedy grin, "his future is ours." In that moment, everything in me changed. The fragile, grieving widow vanished. I sat up straight, the tremor in my voice gone, my eyes as hard and cold as steel. "Thank you, Walter," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that made him flinch. "That's all I needed to hear." His confident smile evaporated, replaced by confusion. "What are you talking about?" "The papers." I smiled, a thin, merciless curve of my lips. "The papers are fake." "But this," I said, gesturing to the hidden cameras, "is very, very real. And my husband would have loved to know that after 41 years, I finally got to see his prize-winning hydrangea." His face contorted in a mask of pure panic as he finally understood. At that exact moment, the front door burst open, and Frank Miller, my retired detective friend, stepped in, flanked by another officer. "Walter Finch," Frank's voice boomed through the silent room, "you're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Reed." As they cuffed him, Walter stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief and hatred. He had walked into my home thinking he was a master manipulator, a ghost come back to claim a prize. He never realized he had walked into a spider's web, meticulously woven by a patient widow who had finally, after 41 years, brought her husband's killer to justice. Checkmate. Justice has been served. Evelyn Reed proved that strength and cunning have no age limit. What did you think of her plan? Let me know in the comments below. If this story of justice and retribution moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with a friend.